The kiss was supposed to be a lie, a desperate performance to escape the chains of an arranged marriage that would destroy everything Min Jun Kang had built. But as his lips pressed against those of his new maid, Imani Foster, something shifted in the carefully constructed walls around his heart. Her soft gasp, the way her dark eyes widened in shock, the tremor that ran through her slender frame, none of it was part of the plan. "What are you doing?" she whispered against his mouth, her voice barely audible over the thundering of his pulse. "Saving us both," he murmured, though he wasn't sure anymore who was saving whom. The woman in his arms, with her natural curls framing her beautiful face and her defiant spirit that refused to bow even to him, had just become the most dangerous person in his world. Not because she could expose his secrets, but because she made him want to be someone worthy of the trust shining in her eyes. The arranged marriage was supposed to secure his empire. Instead, this kiss might just destroy it all. Welcome to Korean Mafia lovers. Hey there, please let us know where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you these emotional stories. The Kang mansion stood like a fortress against the Chicago skyline, its imposing glass and steel structure reflecting the city lights in a display of wealth and power that few could comprehend. Inside its walls, Min Jun Kang moved through the marble corridors with the controlled grace of a man who had learned early that showing weakness meant death. At 35, MJ, as his American associates called him, had transformed his family's legitimate construction business into something far more complex. The Kang organization controlled half of Chicago's underground economy, from the docks to the financial district, all while maintaining the facade of respectability that his grandfather had built decades ago. "Sir," his assistant, David, approached with the cautious respect that everyone in the organization had learned to adopt. "The new domestic staff member has arrived for her interview." MJ didn't look up from the financial report spread across his mahogany desk. The numbers told a story of expansion, of territory gained and enemies eliminated, of an empire that grew stronger each day. "Send her to Mrs. Chen. I don't have time for household matters." "Actually, sir, Mrs. Chen specifically requested that you conduct this interview personally," she said. David hesitated, knowing his boss's patience for interruptions was limited. "She said you'd want to ensure the new hire meets your security standards, given the recent complications." The complications David referred to were the increasing pressure from rival families and the federal investigation that had been circling closer to their operations. Every person who entered the Kang mansion was now a potential threat, and MJ had learned the hard way that enemies often came disguised as servants. "Fine," MJ said, finally looking up. His dark eyes held the kind of intensity that made grown men step back. "Send her to the study. 5 minutes." 20 minutes later, MJ was beginning to think the woman had fled when a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The woman who entered his study was not what he had expected. Imani Foster moved with quiet dignity, her posture straight despite the obvious nervousness in her dark eyes. She wore a simple black dress that was clearly her best, and her natural hair was styled in a neat bun that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, intelligent, determined, and holding a spark of defiance that surprised him. "Mr. Kang," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor he detected. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm Imani Foster." "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. As she settled herself, he studied her with the same attention he gave to potential business partners, looking for tells, for weaknesses, for the truth behind the facade. "Mrs. Chen says you're looking for domestic work. Why here?" Imani met his gaze directly, which was unusual. Most people found it difficult to maintain eye contact with him for long. "Because I need the job, and I heard you pay well for quality work and discretion." "Discretion," he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "What makes you think discretion is important in this position?" "Mr. Kang, I may need this job, but I'm not naive. A man in your position doesn't live in a house like this without having business that requires privacy. I'm not interested in your affairs. I'm interested in earning enough money to support my family." Her directness intrigued him. Family. "My mother has diabetes and needs medication we can't afford. My younger brother is trying to finish college, and my sister." Imani paused, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly. My sister needs to get away from a situation that isn't safe. This job could provide the stability we need." MJ recognized the careful way she spoke about her sister's situation, the same way he spoke about his own business when civilians were present. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that requires money to solve," she said simply. "Mr. Kang, I can clean, cook, manage a household, and keep my mouth shut about whatever I see or hear. In return, I need a salary that can help my family. It's that simple." "Nothing is ever that simple, Miss Foster." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "The people who work in this house see things. They hear conversations. They become part of something larger than themselves, whether they want to or not. Then they're lucky to be part of something that pays well," Imani replied, and he heard the slight edge in her voice. "Mr. Kang, I'm not looking for adventure or excitement. I'm looking for a paycheck. If you can provide that in exchange for good work and silence, then we have a deal. If not, I'll find another position." He turned back to face her, surprised by her boldness. In his world, people didn't give him ultimatums. They begged, they negotiated, they tried to find angles to exploit. But Imani Foster sat in his study like she was interviewing him as much as he was interviewing her. "You understand that working here means your life will be subject to certain security measures, background checks, restricted access to certain areas, confidentiality agreements that are legally binding. I understand. And you understand that the people in my employ are expected to be loyal above all else. I understand that loyalty is earned, Mr. Kang. Treat me with respect. Pay me fairly. And you'll have my discretion and my best work. Try to control my life outside these walls, and you'll have my resignation." MJ found himself almost smiling. Almost. "Mrs. Chen will provide you with the details of your employment. You start tomorrow at 6 a.m. Don't be late." Imani stood, smoothing her dress. "Thank you, Mr. Kang. You won't regret this decision." As she reached the door, he called out, "Miss Foster." She turned back and he saw that spark of defiance still burning in her eyes. "In this house, you'll see and hear things that could be dangerous to know. Are you certain you can handle that?" "Mr. Kang," she said, her hand on the door handle, "I've been handling dangerous situations my whole life. The only difference is that now I'll be getting paid for it." After she left, MJ stood in the silence of his study, replaying the conversation. There was something about Imani Foster that unsettled him, not because she seemed dangerous, but because she seemed fearless. In his experience, fearless people were either very stupid or very strong, and something told him that Imani Foster was far from stupid. He walked to his desk and picked up the background report David had prepared. Clean record, no criminal associations, financial troubles that matched her story. But it was the photo attached to the file that made him pause. The camera had captured her outside a community center, helping an elderly man with his groceries. Her smile in that candid moment was radiant, transforming her entire face with warmth and genuine kindness. MJ set the photo aside and returned to his financial reports, but found his concentration broken. Tomorrow, Imani Foster would begin working in his home, moving through his private spaces, seeing the carefully controlled world he had built. For reasons he couldn't explain, that thought both unsettled and intrigued him. Outside his window, Chicago glittered in the darkness, a city of opportunities and dangers in equal measure. And somewhere in that city, Imani Foster was preparing to enter his world, bringing with her a strength and dignity that he suspected would challenge everything he thought he knew about power and control. The game was about to change, though neither of them knew it yet. Imani's first week at the Kang mansion passed in a blur of learning routines, memorizing preferences, and navigating the subtle hierarchies among the staff. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, had been clear about the rules. Arrive early, work efficiently, speak only when spoken to, and never, under any circumstances, disturb Mr. Kang unless specifically summoned. He values his privacy above all else, Mrs. Chen had explained on Imani's first day. The East Wing is completely off-limits. His study, his bedroom, and his private office are to be cleaned only when he's not present, and only by me. You'll handle the common areas, guest rooms, and kitchen duties. Imani had nodded, filing away each instruction. The pay was better than anything she'd ever earned, and the work, while demanding, was straightforward. She could handle demanding. What she hadn't expected was how the house itself would affect her. The Kang mansion was beautiful in a cold, intimidating way. Every surface gleamed, every piece of furniture was perfectly positioned, every room felt like a museum display rather than a home. But it was the silence that unsettled her most. Despite housing nearly a dozen staff members and frequent visitors, the house felt empty, as if no one truly lived there. She rarely saw MJ during her first week. Occasionally, she'd catch glimpses of him in the morning, impeccably dressed in tailored suits, speaking in low tones with men who carried themselves with the same controlled intensity. She'd learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the marble hallways, measured, purposeful, never hurried. It was during her second week that their carefully maintained distance was shattered. Imani was in the main living room, dusting the expensive art pieces that adorned the walls, when she heard raised voices from the direction of MJ's study. She tried to ignore them, focusing on her work, but the voices grew louder, and she caught fragments of conversation in what sounded like Korean mixed with English. "Not negotiable, Minjun. The Park family expects." "I don't care what they expect. I won't be used as a bargaining chip in their expansion plans." Imani moved closer to the far end of the room, ostensibly to clean the windows, but really to put distance between herself and what was clearly a private conversation. She'd learned in her previous jobs that overhearing the wrong conversation could cost you your position, or worse. Your grandfather's agreement with their family goes back 30 years. You can't simply... "Watch me." The study door slammed open, and MJ strode out, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, an older Korean man in an expensive suit followed, his own expression tight with frustration. "Minjun, be reasonable. Soo-Jin Park is a beautiful woman from a good family. This marriage would strengthen both our organizations and turn me into a puppet dancing to the Park family's tune." MJ stopped in the center of the living room, and Imani realized with growing alarm that she was trapped. Moving now would draw attention to her presence, but staying meant overhearing more of a conversation that could get her fired, or worse. It's not about control, it's about alliance. In our world, personal desires must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good of the family. "My personal desires?" MJ's voice was dangerously quiet. "Uncle, my personal desires stopped mattering the day I took over this organization, but I won't be married off like a prize bull to secure someone else's ambitions." The older man, his uncle apparently, sighed heavily. "The engagement announcement is scheduled for next month. The Park family has already begun preparations. If you back out now, it will be seen as an insult that could lead to war between our families." "Then maybe it's time for war." "Minjun!" The sharp rebuke echoed through the room. "You're thinking with your pride, not your head. This marriage is happening whether you like it or not. The contracts have been signed, the agreements made. You will marry Soo-Jin Park and you will do it with dignity." Imani watched MJ's hands clench into fists at his sides, the only outward sign of the rage she could sense building in him. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Get out." "Minjun, get out." The older man's face flushed with anger, but he apparently knew better than to push further. "This conversation isn't over. The engagement party is in 2 weeks. I suggest you use that time to come to terms with your responsibilities." After his uncle left, MJ stood motionless in the center of the room, his back to Imani. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. She knew she should leave, slip away quietly and pretend she'd heard nothing. Instead, she found herself speaking. "I'm sorry." He spun around, and she saw surprise flash across his features before his expression hardened. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," she said honestly. "I was cleaning and I couldn't leave without hearing about my personal business." His voice was cold, but she detected something else underneath. Exhaustion, maybe, or resignation. "Mr. Kang, what I heard doesn't leave this room." "You have my word." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. "Your word?" "Yes." "And what is the word of a maid worth in my world, Miss Foster?" The question stung, but she kept her voice steady. "The same as the word of anyone else who chooses to keep it. Nothing more, nothing less." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or a grudging respect. "You should go." "Yes, sir." She gathered her cleaning supplies, but as she reached the doorway, she paused. "Mr. Kang?" "What?" "For what it's worth, I think forced marriages are wrong, no matter what world you live in. She left before he could respond, but she felt his eyes on her as she walked away. That night, as she rode the bus home to her small apartment, Imani couldn't shake the image of MJ standing alone in that vast, cold living room, trapped by obligations and expectations that seemed to suffocate him as surely as any prison. She'd taken the job for the money, for the stability it could provide her family, but as she lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking not about the paycheck, but about the loneliness she'd seen in Min-jun Kang's eyes when he thought no one was watching. The next morning she arrived at the mansion to find fresh flowers in the main living room, white orchids that seemed to glow against the dark furniture. Mrs. Chen mentioned that Mr. Kang had specifically requested them, though she seemed puzzled by the unusual request. Imani said nothing, but as she dusted around the delicate blooms, she wondered if they were meant as an apology or a thank you. Either way, they brought a touch of life to the sterile perfection of the room, and she found herself smiling as she worked. She didn't see MJ that day, but she felt his presence in the house differently now, not as the distant, intimidating boss, but as a man trapped by circumstances beyond his control. It was a dangerous shift in perspective, and she knew it, but as she looked at those white orchids, she couldn't bring herself to regret the moment of honesty that had passed between them. The engagement party was still 2 weeks away, but already, Imani could sense the tension building in the house. Staff moved more quietly, conversations were more subdued, and MJ's rare appearances were marked by an even more pronounced air of controlled fury. She told herself it wasn't her business, that her job was to clean and stay invisible. But every time she passed those white orchids, she was reminded that sometimes the most powerful people in the world were also the most trapped, and despite every instinct telling her to stay away, she found herself caring about the fate of Min-jun Kang in a way that had nothing to do with her paycheck. The morning of the engagement party dawned grey and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cut through Chicago's streets like a blade. Imani arrived at the mansion to find it transformed, florists arranging elaborate displays, caterers setting up in the kitchen, and Mrs. Chen directing the chaos with military precision. "The guests will begin arriving at 7, Mrs. Chen informed the assembled staff. "The family has requested that all domestic personnel remain out of sight during the evening. We'll serve from the kitchen and maintain the public areas, but no one is to interact with the guests unless specifically instructed." Imani nodded along with the others, but her attention was drawn to the massive portrait that had been hung in the main foyer, a formal photograph of MJ standing beside a beautiful Korean woman in an elegant white dress. Soo-jin Park was stunning, with delicate features and a smile that seemed painted on for the camera. But it was MJ's expression that made Imani's chest tighten. He looked like a man attending his own funeral. "Miss Foster," Mrs. Chen's sharp voice cut through her thoughts, "you'll be responsible for maintaining the powder rooms and ensuring the coat check area remains organized. Under no circumstances are you to enter the main reception areas." "Understood." The day passed in a blur of preparation. Imani caught glimpses of MJ throughout the afternoon, always surrounded by men in expensive suits, his face an impassive mask. He wore a traditional Korean hanbok for the ceremony, a stunning black and gold ensemble that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. But his eyes remained cold, distant, as if he'd retreated somewhere deep inside himself. As evening approached, the guests began to arrive. Imani watched from the kitchen as Chicago's elite filed through the mansion, politicians, business leaders, and what she suspected were members of other Korean families. The women were draped in designer gowns and glittering jewelry, the men in tailored tuxedos that probably cost more than she made in a year. "Quite a show, isn't it?" David, MJ's assistant, appeared beside her at the kitchen window. "All this pageantry for a marriage that neither party wants." "Neither party?" Imani asked, surprised by his candor. "Soo-jin Park is in love with someone else, a doctor her family considers beneath their station. This arrangement is as much a prison for her as it is for him." David's expression was grim. "But in families like ours, love is a luxury we can't afford." Before Imani could respond, Mrs. Chen clapped her hands for attention. "The ceremony is beginning. Everyone to your positions." Imani made her way to the powder room area, a small alcove near the main reception hall. From her position, she could hear the ceremonial music and the low murmur of voices as the engagement ritual began. She tried to focus on her duties, but found herself straining to hear what was happening in the next room. The traditional Korean ceremony was beautiful and elaborate, with ritual exchanges of gifts and formal bows between the families. But when she heard MJ's voice, speaking the traditional words of commitment, she detected a hollow quality that made her heart ache for him. It was nearly an hour later when disaster struck. Imani was restocking towels in the powder room when she heard raised voices from the main hall. At first, she assumed it was part of the celebration, but the tone was wrong, angry, confrontational. She moved closer to the doorway, trying to understand what was happening. "Insulting our family with this charade," a man's voice boomed over the crowd. "Everyone knows Min Jun Kang has no intention of honoring this engagement." "Mr. Park, please," came another voice, probably MJ's uncle. "This is neither the time nor the place. When is the time? When your nephew makes a fool of my daughter in front of all of Chicago? We have witnesses who say he's been seen with other women, that he has no respect for this arrangement." Imani's blood ran cold. She knew she should retreat, should disappear into the kitchen and pretend she'd heard nothing. But something in the escalating tension kept her frozen in place. "That's enough," MJ's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mr. Park, you will not speak about my character or my intentions in my own home." "Your intentions?" Mr. Park's laugh was bitter. "Your intentions are clear, boy. You think you can play games with my family's honor?" "I think," MJ said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that you should remember where you are and who you're speaking to." The threat in his tone was unmistakable, and Imani could hear the sudden silence that fell over the crowd. But Mr. Park was either too angry or too proud to back down. "Is that a threat, Min Jun? In front of all these witnesses? You would threaten the father of your bride-to-be?" "I would defend my honor against anyone who questions it." The situation was spiraling out of control, and Imani could sense the potential for violence in the air. In families like these, public humiliation could lead to bloodshed. She knew she should stay hidden, should let the powerful men handle their own affairs. Instead, she found herself stepping into the hallway. She moved quickly toward the main reception hall, her heart pounding. She had no plan, no idea what she could possibly do to defuse a situation involving men who controlled half of Chicago's underworld. But she couldn't stand by and watch MJ be forced into a corner that might destroy everything he'd built. As she reached the entrance to the reception hall, she could see the scene unfolding. MJ and Mr. Park facing each other in the center of the room, surrounded by a crowd of tense, silent guests. Soo-Jin Park stood to one side, her face pale with embarrassment and fear. The air crackled with the kind of tension that preceded violence. "You want proof of my commitment?" MJ was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "You want assurance that I take this engagement seriously? I want respect for my family and my daughter. Then you'll have it." MJ turned, scanning the crowd, and his eyes found Imani in the doorway. For a moment their gazes locked, and she saw something desperate and wild in his expression. Then, before she could react, he was moving toward her with purposeful strides. "You want to see my commitment to this family?" he called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Then witness this." He reached Imani in 3 quick steps, and before she could speak, before she could even breathe, his hands were cupping her face, and his lips were crushing against hers in a kiss that was fierce, possessive, and completely unexpected. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts, but Imani heard none of it. The world had narrowed to the warmth of MJ's mouth on hers, the strength of his hands holding her face, the way her entire body seemed to come alive under his touch. The kiss was supposed to be a performance, a desperate gambit to escape an impossible situation. But as his lips moved against hers with surprising gentleness, as his thumb brushed across her cheek in a gesture that felt achingly tender, she realized that something real was happening between them. When he finally pulled away, his eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "I'm so sorry." Then he turned back to the stunned crowd, his arm sliding around Imani's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, "I'd like you to meet the woman I'm going to marry. The engagement to Miss Park is hereby dissolved." The chaos that followed was immediate and explosive. Mr. Park's roar of rage, Sujin's gasp of shock, the uncle's stream of furious Korean, and the excited chatter of guests who had just witnessed the social event of the decade. But through it all, MJ kept his arm around Imani, anchoring her to his side as the storm raged around them. As security moved to escort the Park family out and the crowd began to disperse in excited clusters, Imani realized that her life had just changed irrevocably. She was no longer just the maid who cleaned the mansion and kept her mouth shut. She was now the woman who had kissed Min Jun Kang in front of Chicago's most powerful families, the woman he had claimed as his own in a moment of desperate defiance. And as she looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the mixture of regret and something deeper burning there, she realized that she was in far more danger than she had ever imagined, not from his enemies or his world, but from the way her heart was racing and the way she already wanted him to kiss her again. The silence in MJ's study was deafening after the chaos of the evening. Imani sat in the leather chair across from his desk, still wearing her simple black uniform, while he paced the room like a caged predator. The formal hanbok had been replaced by a white dress shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and dark slacks. His hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and she could see the tension radiating from every line of his body. "This is a disaster," he said for the third time, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I've destroyed everything. The alliance with the Parks, the stability we've maintained for years, your safety." "My safety?" Imani interrupted, finding her voice for the first time since they'd retreated to the study. "What about my safety?" He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with something that looked like anguish. "Do you understand what I've done? What I've made you a part of? The Park family doesn't forgive insults, Imani. By claiming you publicly, by dissolving the engagement in front of half of Chicago's elite, I've painted a target on your back." "You didn't claim me," she said quietly. "You used me." The words hit him like a physical blow, and she saw him flinch. "You're right. I used you, and I'm sorry. I saw you standing there, and I was desperate, and I—" He ran his hands through his hair again, the gesture making him look younger, more vulnerable. "I never should have involved you in this." Imani studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse there, but also something else, something that made her pulse quicken despite the gravity of their situation. "The kiss," she said carefully, "was all of it just for show?" MJ went very still, his eyes locking with hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear him, he said, "No." The admission hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric. Imani felt her breath catch as she processed what he'd just confessed. "MJ, don't." He turned away from her, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "Don't say anything that will make this worse than it already is." "How could it be worse?" she asked, standing up from the chair. "You've just told Chicago's underworld that you're involved with your maid. Your uncle looked like he wanted to murder both of us, and now you're telling me that the kiss that started all this wasn't entirely fake." "It wasn't fake at all," he said without turning around. "That's the problem." Imani moved closer to him, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. "Then why are you acting like it's the end of the world?" "Because it is." He finally turned to face her, and she was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "Because I'm Min Jun Kang, and you're Imani Foster, and there's no universe where this ends well for either of us." "Why not?" "Why not?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I'm the head of a criminal organization, Imani. Because I've killed people who threatened what's mine. Because my world is violence and power and control, and you're—" He gestured helplessly. "You're everything good that I've never had. I'm not some innocent flower, MJ. I've lived in the real world my whole life. I've seen violence, I've dealt with dangerous people, not like this." His voice was sharp. "Not like me." "Then tell me," she said, stepping closer until she was within arm's reach. "Tell me who you really are. Stop hiding behind this mask of the untouchable crime boss, and tell me the truth." For a moment she thought he might actually do it. His guard dropped, and she saw the man beneath the carefully constructed facade, lonely, burdened, desperate for connection. But then his phone rang, shattering the moment. He answered it with a curt, "What?" and listened for several seconds, his expression growing darker with each word. "How many?" he asked finally. "Where?" Another pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He hung up and turned to her, his face once again the impassive mask she'd come to recognize. "I have to go. David will drive you home, and starting tomorrow, you'll have protection." "Protection from what?" "From the consequences of my actions." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Imani, what happened tonight? It can't happen again, for your sake and mine." "What if I don't want protection?" she called after him. "What if I want the truth instead?" He paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. "The truth is that I'm falling for a woman I can never have, and it's going to destroy us both." Then he was gone, leaving Imani alone in the study with the echo of his words and the memory of a kiss that had changed everything. The ride home with David was tense and silent. He kept checking the mirrors, his hand never far from what she suspected was a concealed weapon. When they reached her apartment building, he walked her to the door and handed her a business card. "My number," he said simply. "If anything seems wrong, anything at all, you call me immediately." "David," she said as he turned to leave, "what happened tonight? How bad is it really?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw sympathy in his eyes. "Bad enough that your life will never be the same. But maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. I've worked for MJ for 8 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight." After he left, Imani climbed the stairs to her small apartment, her mind reeling from everything that had happened. She'd gone to work that morning as a maid trying to support her family. She was coming home as the woman who had publicly humiliated one of Chicago's most powerful families and captured the heart of a man who claimed he was too dangerous to love. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she could still feel the warmth of MJ's lips on hers, could still see the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd admitted the kiss was real. He'd said their situation was impossible, that it could only end in disaster. But as she drifted off to sleep, Imani found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the risk. The next morning, she woke to find 2 men in dark suits standing outside her apartment building. Her protection had arrived, and with it, the reality that her life had indeed changed forever. The question now was whether she was brave enough to fight for something real with a man who believed he was too dangerous to deserve love. As she got ready for what she suspected would be her last normal day for a very long time, Imani made a decision. MJ might think their situation was impossible, but she'd been fighting impossible odds her entire life. And for the first time in years, she'd found something, someone worth fighting for. The game had changed and she was ready to play. 3 days after the engagement party, Imani returned to the Kang mansion to find it transformed once again. The elegant decorations were gone, replaced by an atmosphere of barely controlled chaos. Men in dark suits moved through the corridors with purpose, their voices low and urgent. Mrs. Chen met her at the service entrance, her usual composed demeanor cracked with worry. "Miss Foster," she said, wringing her hands, "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "Why wouldn't I?" Imani asked, though she could guess the answer. "Because of what happened at the party, because of the danger." Mrs. Chen lowered her voice. "The Park family is furious. They're calling for retribution, and there are rumors that other families are questioning Mr. Kang's judgment, his fitness to lead." Imani felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "Where is he?" "In meetings all morning. The elders from the other families are here. And his uncle." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "I've never seen the house like this. It feels like we're preparing for war." As if summoned by her words, the sound of raised voices echoed from the direction of the main conference room. Imani recognized MJ's voice among them, calm but with an edge of steel that made her stomach clench with worry. "Perhaps you should go home," Mrs. Chen suggested gently, "until things settle down." "No," Imani said firmly. "I have work to do." She spent the morning cleaning mechanically, her attention focused on the sounds coming from the conference room. The voices rose and fell in what sounded like heated debate, occasionally punctuated by sharp words in Korean that she didn't understand, but could interpret from their tone. It was nearly noon when the conference room doors finally opened, and a stream of older Korean men emerged, their faces grim. Imani caught glimpses of them from the kitchen, distinguished gentlemen in expensive suits who carried themselves with the authority of men accustomed to being obeyed. But their expressions were troubled, and she heard fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Unprecedented breach of protocol. Cannot allow personal desires to compromise. Other families are watching, waiting for signs of weakness. MJ's uncle was the last to emerge, and his face was thunderous. He paused in the hallway, speaking in rapid Korean to one of his associates, and though Imani couldn't understand the words, his tone was unmistakably furious. After the last of the visitors had left, silence settled over the mansion like a heavy blanket. Imani waited, torn between the desire to seek out MJ and the knowledge that he probably needed space to process whatever had just happened. The decision was made for her when David appeared in the kitchen doorway. "He wants to see you," he said simply. The study. Imani found MJ standing behind his desk, his hands braced on its surface as he stared down at a collection of documents spread before him. He'd discarded his suit jacket, and his white shirt was wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. When he looked up at her entrance, she was shocked by the exhaustion in his eyes. "You came back," he said, and she heard surprise in his voice. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you wouldn't, for your own safety." He straightened, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "The last 3 days have been complicated. Tell me." He studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his words. "The Park family is demanding compensation for the public humiliation. My uncle and the other family elders are questioning my leadership, my ability to make rational decisions. There are rumors that some of our business partners are reconsidering their alliances. Because of me. Because of my choices," he corrected firmly, "because I chose to follow my heart instead of my head for the first time in my life." The admission hung between them, and Imani felt her pulse quicken. "And do you regret it?" "I should," he said quietly. "Every logical part of me says I should regret it, should find a way to fix this mess and restore the status quo. But—" He moved around the desk, stopping just close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I can't stop thinking about that kiss, about the way you felt in my arms, about the way you looked at me like I was worth saving. You are worth saving." "Am I?" His laugh was bitter. "Imani, in the last 3 days, I've had to authorize the elimination of 2 men who were planning to use this situation to move against us. I've threatened families that have been our allies for decades. I've made decisions that will have consequences for years to come." "Does that sound like a man worth saving?" "It sounds like a man protecting what's his," she said softly. "It sounds like a man who's been forced to make impossible choices his entire life." "And what about the choice I made with you? Was that impossible too?" The question was loaded with meaning, and Imani felt the weight of it settle around them. She could give him the easy answer, could tell him it was a mistake and walk away, returning to her simple life and leaving him to his complicated world. Or she could tell him the truth. "No," she said finally. "That choice felt like the first real thing that's happened to me in years." Something shifted in his expression, hope warring with caution. "Imani, if we do this, if we try to make this real, there's no going back. My world will become your world, with all the dangers that entails. The people who want to hurt me will try to hurt you. Your family could become targets. Your life will never be simple again." "My life was never simple," she replied. "I've been fighting to survive, to protect my family, to make something better for all of us. The only difference now is that I'd be fighting for something I actually want." "And what do you want?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat, to catch the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with something uniquely him. "I want you," she said simply. "I want the man who puts flowers in his living room, because his maid mentioned that the house feels cold. I want the man who's been carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders since he was barely old enough to understand what that meant. I want the man who kissed me like I was the most precious thing in his world." "You are," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are the most precious thing in my world, and that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because precious things in my world get destroyed." "Then don't let me be destroyed," she said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Protect me. Fight for me, choose me, not because it's easy or logical or safe, but because it's real." For a moment, he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if he were memorizing the feel of her hands on his skin. When he opened them again, she saw the moment he made his decision. "The Park family wants a meeting," and he said, Tomorrow night, they're demanding satisfaction for the insult to their daughter. What kind of satisfaction? The kind that usually ends in bloodshed. His hands came up to cover hers, his fingers intertwining with hers. But I have a different proposal for them, which is, I'm going to offer them something they value more than revenge. I'm going to offer them a partnership that will make both our families more powerful than they ever imagined. And I'm going to make it clear that you are under my protection, that any threat to you is a threat to me. And if they refuse? His expression hardened, and for a moment she saw the dangerous man that his enemies feared. Then they'll learn why the Kang family has survived and thrived in this city for 30 years. Before she could respond, he was kissing her, his lips claiming hers with a passion that made her knees weak. This kiss was different from the one at the party, deeper, more desperate, filled with the promise of everything they could be together if they were brave enough to fight for it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I love you, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I love you too," she whispered back, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. "And I'm not going anywhere." Outside the study windows, Chicago glittered in the afternoon sun, a city full of opportunities and dangers in equal measure. But inside the sanctuary of MJ's arms, Imani felt safer and more alive than she ever had before. They had battles ahead of them, enemies to face, and a world to navigate together. But for the first time in both their lives, they weren't facing it alone. The kiss that had started as a desperate lie had become the foundation of something real and powerful and worth fighting for. And as MJ held her close, whispering promises against her hair, Imani knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Years later, Imani stood in the same living room where everything had changed, watching the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that now felt warm and welcoming, rather than cold and intimidating. The white orchids that had once been MJ's apology had been replaced by fresh flowers that she chose herself each week, bright, vibrant blooms that filled the space with life and color. The Kang mansion was still impressive, still powerful, but it had become something it had never been before. A home. "Yoma!" The sound of running feet echoed through the hallway, followed by a giggle that never failed to make Imani's heart swell. 5-year-old Grace Kang burst into the room, her dark curls bouncing as she launched herself into Imani's arms. "What are you doing up, little one?" Imani asked, smoothing her daughter's hair. "It's past your bedtime." "Appa is telling stories again," Grace said, her eyes bright with mischief. "He's telling Uncle David about the time he kissed you in front of everyone and made them all very surprised." Imani laughed, shaking her head. "Is he now? And what did Uncle David say about that?" "He said Appa was very brave and very stupid at the same time," Grace reported solemnly. "What does that mean?" "It means," came a familiar voice from the doorway, "that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is also the most foolish." MJ entered the room, still handsome in his perfectly tailored suit, though there were now laugh lines around his eyes and a softness to his expression that hadn't been there years ago. "And was it?" Imani asked, settling Grace more comfortably in her arms. "Foolish?" MJ moved to stand behind them, his arms encircling both his wife and daughter. "The most beautifully foolish thing I've ever done," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of Imani's head. "And the best decision of my life." The Park family meeting that had seemed so threatening years ago had indeed ended in partnership rather than bloodshed. So Jin Park had married her doctor and sent Imani a beautiful bouquet with a note, thanking her for freeing them both from an arrangement that would have made everyone miserable. The other families had eventually accepted MJ's choice, especially when it became clear that his happiness had made him an even more formidable leader. Imani's family had been shocked, then worried, then finally accepting when they saw how completely MJ loved and protected their daughter. Her mother's medical bills were no longer a source of stress, her brother had graduated college debt-free, and her sister had been able to escape her dangerous situation and start fresh in a new city. "Tell me the story, Appa," Grace demanded, settling back against Imani's chest. "Tell me about the kiss that changed everything." MJ's eyes met Imani's over their daughter's head, and she saw the same love and wonder there that had been present on their wedding day, when he'd whispered his vows in both Korean and English, promising to love and protect her for all the days of his life. Once upon a time, he began, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that Grace loved, there was a very stubborn man who thought he had to face the world alone. As MJ wove the tale of their beginning, carefully edited for young ears, Imani reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The path hadn't always been easy. There had been threats to navigate, enemies to face, and the constant challenge of building a life together across the divide of their different worlds. But they had faced it all together, and in doing so had created something beautiful and lasting. The criminal empire still existed, but it had evolved under MJ's leadership into something more legitimate, more focused on protection and community building than violence and intimidation. Imani had found her own role in that world, using her natural empathy and strength to help other women who found themselves in dangerous situations, creating safe houses and support networks that operated under the Kang family's protection. "And they lived happily ever after?" Grace asked sleepily as MJ finished the story. "They lived lovingly ever after," Imani corrected gently. "Because happiness isn't something that just happens. It's something you choose to build together every single day." "Like building blocks?" Grace asked, her eyes already drooping. "Exactly like building blocks," MJ said, lifting his daughter into his arms. "Come on, little architect, time for bed." As he carried Grace upstairs, Imani remained by the window, looking out at the city that had witnessed their beginning. Somewhere out there, other people were facing impossible choices, fighting for love against overwhelming odds, discovering that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first walked into this house, desperate, proud, determined to survive on her own terms. That woman was still there, but she'd grown stronger, more confident, surrounded by love and support she'd never imagined possible. "Regrets?" MJ asked, returning to slip his arms around her from behind. "Only one," she said, leaning back against his chest. "What's that?" "I regret that it took us so long to find each other." He turned her in his arms, his hands framing her face the same way they had on that night when everything changed. "Maybe we found each other exactly when we were supposed to, when we were both ready to be brave enough to choose love over fear." Korean Mafia boss kisses his new maid to avoid an arranged marriage, Imani said, smiling at the memory. "If someone had told me that story years ago, I would have said it was too crazy to be true. And now? Now I know that the craziest stories are often the most beautiful ones." She stood on her toes to kiss him, tasting the promise of all their tomorrows in the warmth of his lips. "I love you, Minjun Kang. And I love you, Mrs. Kang," he whispered against her mouth. "Forever and always." Outside their window, Chicago sparkled in the darkness, a city of endless possibilities, where a maid and a mafia boss had found their way to each other against all odds, and in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the love they'd built together, they knew that some stories really do have the most perfect endings.